In May of this year, the BMJ ran a feature on declining sex in Britain. Now, sex sells, so there was huge media coverage of this worldwide. The BMJ article and the media coverage fingered depression as the likeliest cause for this, not the antidepressants that we take to treat depression, even though they're much more likely to cause us to lose interest in making love, or the ability to make love. A month later, the European Medicines Agency came out and said they were going to ask the pharmaceutical companies that make SSRI antidepressants to put a warning in their labels that people can be left permanently unable to make love after they've halted treatment. There was no media coverage of this at all. For some reason, when it comes to antidepressants, sex doesn't sell. The strange story of the Antidepressants and Sex begins in 1960 with this man you see here, Frank Aid. Frank Aid is a US psychiatrist. He's a staunch Catholic, a father of 12 children, an advisor to several popes on what the new drugs that were being brought out to treat nervous problems can do. And he's also the discoverer of a drug called amitriptyline, which was one of the first generation of antidepressants and the best-selling drug in the group. Prior to drugs like amitriptyline, the treatment for melancholia, as it was called then, was electroshock therapy. And Aid had given electroshock to his own father on their kitchen table. So a drug like amitriptyline was a godsend to people like Aid's father, and a godsend to doctors like Aid. And he had no wish to cast a cloud over it, but he was still, within the first year of it being out, he was reporting that it could cause sexual dysfunction in some people. The next step in the antidepressant and sex story comes about 10 years later, when this man you see here, George Beaumont, who was working for Geigy Pharmaceuticals, had the job of trying to find a niche for clomipramine. We now recognize this as the most potent antidepressant we have, but then it was just one of a long list of antidepressants that had been brought out for what was a very rare condition back then, and it wasn't clear that there was a niche for it. Beaumont spotted the fact that this drug could be helpful for obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and anyone who's on a pill for OCD these days is on it because of George Beaumont. He also had stories placed in several tabloid newspapers about a minor celebrity who was thrilled with clomipramine. And she was thrilled because while the antidepressant dose of this is 150 milligrams, when her boyfriend took 10 milligrams 30 minutes before sex, his premature ejaculation problem was solved, making her very happy. 10 years later again, clomipramine had begun to encroach on behavior therapy, which was then the leading treatment for OCD. And the leading exponent of behavior therapy was Isaac Marks, whom you see here. And Marks fought back. He said, look, these drugs don't just cause problems when you go on them. They can cause problems after you stop. He'd had lots of patients who'd had repeated orgasms after they stopped clomipramine. And one of them, he said, was a nun. Think of that. This may be the first report of what was later called persistent genital arousal disorder, which was described about 15 years later by Sandra Lieblum, whom you see here. Lieblum was a therapist, but rather than thinking trauma or whatever was causing the sexual problems some of the women she was seeing were having, she thought the persistent orgasms that they were having were linked to a physical problem. And we now recognize that the menopause can trigger this, even though it can also happen in men. But stopping drugs which are serotonin reuptake inhibiting drugs, which includes the antidepressants, anxiolytics, antihistamines, antibiotics, analgesics, and others, was the most common trigger to it. Let me take you back to clomipramine and 1990, when the selective serotonin reuptake inhibiting drugs, the SSRIs, are about to be brought on the market as antidepressants. Now, they're not being brought on the market to treat melancholia, which is a rare condition. For every 100 people who've got nervous problems, only one has melancholia, and the other 99 have nerves of one sort or the other that doctors are happy to give benzodiazepines for. But these are older drugs for which the pharmaceutical company is not making much money from them. So the plan was to replace the benzodiazepines with the SSRIs, and doctors began to hear that if you continue to give benzodiazepines to which people can get hooked, you may get sued. What you want to do is stop treating the superficial nervous problem and get at the underlying mood disorder with an antidepressant. And of course, you can't get hooked to antidepressants. This was a lie. When they'd given the SSRIs to healthy volunteers, companies had seen that you could get hooked to them within just a few weeks and have problems coming off them. And within 3 years of one of these SSRIs coming on the market, there were more reports of people hooked and having problems getting off it than there had been in 20 years of all of the benzodiazepines combined. The other thing we heard was when the SSRIs came out, the labels of these drugs said less than 5% of people had sexual dysfunction on these drugs in clinical trials. The problem here was that in their healthy volunteer trials, companies had seen that more than 50% of people could have sexual dysfunction, and in some cases it was severe, and in some cases it lasted after the treatment was halted. So how does more than 50% become less than 5%? Well, the trick lies in clinical trials. And in clinical trials of patients, the investigators have been asked to look closely at whether the drug works or not. And they've got endless boxes and endless pages to work their way through. And right at the end, they've got one page about the adverse effects that a drug can cause. And they're not likely to pay too much heed to a problem like sexual changes, which they've been told the illness causes anyway. And of course, the other aspect to this is that in the healthy volunteer trials that they do, companies spot the problems that they need to manage in their later clinical trials. They can manage them down to the point of saying to an investigator like me, don't ask questions about sex. Anyway, when these drugs came on the market, doctors like me were encouraged to tell people that, look, the problem will clear up once you halt the drug. Yes, it can happen, but it clears. And if need be, if you want to go away for a romantic weekend, then you can just halt the drug for the weekend and things will be fine. The story continued to be that these effects were rare, even though surveys began to come out saying that it could be more than 50% of the people who were put on these drugs who were having problems. And even though one of the companies, Lilly, brought Depoxetine, an SSRI, on the market for premature ejaculation problems. And for them to do this, they have to be pretty confident that close to 100% of the men that take this drug are going to have a change in their sexual functioning. Okay, so that's where the problem sat for about 10 years or so. It turns out that as early as 1987, there had been a first report to regulators of what was possibly an enduring sexual dysfunction after treatment had been stopped. Certainly by 1991, there was a report to British regulators of people having an enduring problem after Prozac had been stopped. The first hints that I had that there might be a condition called post-SSRI sexual dysfunction, PSSD, was in 2000 when a lady came to see me and said she was having problems because of the antidepressant she was on. And I said, sure, but this will clear when you halt the treatment. And she said, no, I've been off this for 3 months and I can take a hard bristled brush and rub it up and down my genitals and feel nothing. We tried all sorts of things, Viagra and whatever, to see could it make a difference, and nothing helped her. A few years later, Audrey Berrick, whom you see here, and Anthony Choka reported in 2006 about the condition that we now call PSSD. They were greatly helped by patients who had the problem, most of whom, however, were very stigmatized by it and felt they didn't want anyone to know who they were. But a key person whom you see here, Kevin Bennett, came out and said, look, I have this condition, and he put himself up on YouTube, and he went along to academic meetings and was prepared to stand behind the fact that he had the problem and let people cross-examine him. And this is the way we establish if a drug is causing a problem or not. You let people like doctors or whoever ask you all sorts of questions about things that they think might conceivably be causing the problem. And if they can't see any other way to explain it except the pill, then it's the pill that's caused it. That's the best way to link a pill to a problem. The other thing that became clear from Kevin and lots of other people who had the problem is that many of them had had it at that stage for 10 years. They've been on these drugs in the early 1990s and they had not been able to make love since. So, what is PSSD? Well, it affects all ages, it affects both sexes, it affects all ethnic groups. It's a condition that's captured in the image that you see here, which is a painting by Bill James, taken from Cellini's paintings, one of which is Venus Rising, and the other is the Outcast that you see there, and both are frozen. What you've got is genital numbing, a loss of function, and loss of libido. And added to that is often an emotional disconnection, which people say can be even worse than the genital numbing. A few years later, a post-finasteride syndrome was reported in 2011, which is almost identical. And again, it was clear that people had been having this for many years before it was actually put in the literature first. And in 2014, a post-retinoid syndrome. That's a condition caused by giving isotretinoin to people for acne, Accutane. And in this case, there had been a very famous case in 2006 where a man who'd had sexual dysfunction after Accutane murdered the doctor who had put him on the drug. In internet forums, people with PSSD or PFS or PRSD, as we call it now, have tried all sorts of drugs acting on the serotonin system and the dopamine system, drugs acting like Viagra, metals, herbs, operation, all sorts of things to try and pinpoint what's going on and to try and see if there's a cure. Nothing has helped so far. The other thing that's clear is that some of the people who've been on these forums have gone on to commit suicide. And assisted dying centres like Dignitas in Zurich have been in touch with me to ask more about PSSD because they're hearing from patients who have this condition. These are young people, young men and young women who have the condition, who figure that life is not worth living anymore. So in 2014, with colleagues from risk.org, we had collected 120 cases of PSSD or PFS or PRSD and published these. In 2018, we published an article on 300 cases, and we now have close to 500 cases. So faced with this, we figured it might be an idea to petition the Food and Drugs Administration in the United States and the European Medicines Agency in Europe to get them to ask companies to include this problem in the label of the drugs. Why? Well, one of the reasons was that lots of people with the problem say it's awful having the problem, but just as bad is the fact that when you go along to doctors or hospitals or healthcare generally, we often face ridicule. Doctors say to us, look, there's no way a drug could be causing the problem if it's been out of your body for months. If you continue to Google these things, you're going to have problems for the rest of your life. You need to go to therapy, or maybe you need an antidepressant. The hope was that if we could get the problem included in the label of the drug, that people could at least point to that, and it might mean that the response they get from healthcare would be more sympathetic. It also might mean that people would have a greater incentive to look for a possible cure. But the regulators worldwide have had tens of thousands of cases of this problem reported to them over a 30-year period and have done nothing. So why would the regulators do anything in response to our petition? Well, here you see the execution of Walter Raleigh in 1618. And this is relevant here because Raleigh was convicted and executed on the basis of people saying things about what he'd said or did outside the court. They wouldn't come in to be cross-examined, to give him a chance to show that what they were saying couldn't be right. This was what became called hearsay. And after his death, the UK legal system said, look, we cannot admit hearsay evidence ever again. If people don't come into court to be cross-examined, then the evidence doesn't count. When you have a problem on a drug, any problem on a drug, your doctor, when they submit a report to the regulators, does not put your name on it. This report immediately becomes hearsay. It becomes anecdote, so regulators file them away. If doctors or you report a problem to a company and leave your name on it, the company is obliged to follow you up, to cross-examine you, to look at your medical records. They'll often be looking at these things to see can they see any other way to explain the problem than their drug, but they'll often conclude that there is no other way to explain the problem, and they will put the problem in the label of the drug. So we thought about this and said we'd write to FDA, who didn't reply, and to EMA and say, look, we've got a bunch of people here who may be willing to put their names on reports and give you their contact details. Would you be willing to have them? And EMA responded and said, yes, indeed, and gave us a very small window to try and get the material back to them. So in a big rush, we got 84 people who were willing to give EMA their names and contact details so they could be cross-examined about the problem. And 32 doctors wrote letters saying, yes, this person has had an SSRI, yes, they have a sexual problem, and there's no other obvious way to explain the problem other than the drug that they're on. But an extraordinary thing happened then. When we got this into EMA, what EMA did next was weird. They removed everybody's name and contact details and sent the material out to the people that they'd asked to look at the problem and decide if the drug is causing a problem or not. When this happened, we were pretty sure that EMA were not going to say that these drugs cause a problem. But, as you've seen, they said, yes, actually, we're going to ask the companies to include it in the label of the drug. Why do they say this? Well, the likeliest reason is that the SSRIs are older drugs, and just like the benzodiazepines 30 years beforehand, the companies market the problems of older drugs that they want to get rid of. So too, companies now trying to bring new drugs on the market for nervous problems want to get rid of the SSRIs that are an older bunch of drugs from which they're not making any money. That's the likeliest explanation of what's going on. But the key message for me in all of this is that in terms of establishing a problem a drug causes, your name, and ideally the name of the doctor who's put you on the drug or who's treating you now, are the key things, and your willingness to be cross-examined is probably the single best thing there is in trying to establish a drug causes a problem, and you're probably better placed reporting it to companies rather than regulators. So this brings us back to the point we began at. People in Britain, and probably throughout the Western and developed world, are making love less often than they used to do before. 10% of the populations in most developed countries are on one of these antidepressants, and they're on them chronically. They're not able to get off them. These people are not going to be making love the way they would wish to be. And it's not just the 10% on the pills. They've got partners who are probably not able to make love the way they would wish to do either. In some towns in Wales, where I work, up to a third of the population is on an antidepressant, which may mean that 50% of the town is not able to make love the way they would wish to. Many of these people will hold on to the hope that once they stop the treatment, everything will be okay. But there's no guarantee that this is the case, and every chance that for a lot of people, we just don't know how many, things will be much, much worse. So there's a pressing need to find out what's causing PSSD and ways to try and treat it. But there's another pressing need here, which is, as Frank Age showed us, back in 1960, when a doctor reported a problem on a drug, within a year, people accepted this could happen. Now, in 2020, the chances of significant problems on a drug, things that are happening very commonly on a drug, being picked up and recognized by the doctor who puts you on the drug, are much less. It can take 10 or 20 or 30 years before a problem that a drug causes is properly accepted and recognized. Things began changing around 1990, the point where the SSRIs come on the market, and there's a pressing need for us to try and work out what exactly happened then to cause this huge delay in things being recognized. And probably the single thing that happened most is the fact that your name began to be removed from reports. And if we're going to reverse this, people need to step up to the plate and insist on their names being kept there, and ideally the names of both themselves and the doctor who's put them on whatever treatment. And this needs to be, that they need to indicate as well that both you and your doctor are willing to be cross-examined about these things. This is what's going to get us back to a position where the treatments that we get put on are going to be as safe as possible. Thanks.